In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger launched in unusually cold conditions, and a known O-ring vulnerability failed, causing the shuttle to break apart just about a minute after liftoff. More on this moment in a second, but I need to set the scene for the video so you understand what we're doing. History's biggest failures rarely come from lack of rules. They actually come from rules becoming as a replacement for judgment. Most people think catastrophic failures happen because people ignored the rules, but that's actually almost never true. More often, they happen because people followed the rules instead of trusting their judgment. Hi, I'm Dr. 𝒓𝒂𝒏𝒊𝒛𝒂𝒐𝒏. I'm a clinical psychologist who works with high-stakes professionals and organizations both before and after critical incidents. So here's a little known backstory on that 1986 disaster. Before the Challenger ever launched, NASA had actually already been experiencing some multiple near failures. They actually had an O-ring erosion that had been observed on previous shuttle flights but didn't stop anything. The seals had damaged after launch, but because those missions returned safely, the risk really kind of became normalized instead of investigated. And then there'd also been some instances where foam strikes had happened where it came off of the ship and actually had broken off and hit the shuttle. And again, because the catastrophic failure didn't occur immediately, the hazard was just documented, but really not treated as a mission-stopping event. So nothing really halted these altogether. Because of these events, because they were stressful and public, and they also carried like reputational and political pressure, the implications subsequently led to major shifts in how NASA ended up functioning. And like most high-risk organizations, after close calls, NASA actually responded with a very reactionary but common goal. Make sure this never happens again. That was the goal. Over time, the belief formed inside the system, though, that if we stay within the rules, if we follow established procedures, we can actually control all the bad things from happening. And given the pressure on NASA, the belief actually made sense. It made operations and systems feel pretty predictable, reduced anxiety, it gave people something tangible to rely on after close calls and uncertainty. And by the way, at first it totally worked. However, on the day of the launch, engineers raised concerns. The temperature was unusually cold, and they had actually expressed worry about that O-ring holding on and having good performance. But here was the main problem. There was actually no explicit rule saying that launch had to be stopped at that temperature. And that's where previous launches where the O-ring had ruptured without catastrophic failure kind of came into play here. So when judgment conflicted with procedure, the system of decision-making defaulted to what had been previously determined to be reasonable, based on rules and compliance. And human judgment actually came to be seen as a risk. And as most of us probably remember or have heard about, at least in history class, the Challenger launched, and 73 seconds into the launch, the shuttle broke apart, killing all 7 crew members. Now, as mentioned earlier, I'm a psychologist who works with organizations both before and after critical incidents. Not to analyze anything necessarily that went wrong, but to understand how those events change how people think, decide, and lead afterwards, and also get out ahead of any potential problems. So this happens oftentimes, this overcorrection happens when organizations don't learn the right lessons after bad events. After near misses, critical incidents, systems run, by the way, by anxious and kind of traumatized humans often clamp down, and then they create more rules, tighter policies, less discretion, and have less tolerance for uncertainty. And all of this happens with the best intentions and all in the name of safety. But by the way, safety isn't created or generated with just rules either. So this is a core belief behind my work with organizations. Rules are very important, but rules can't replace judgment either. I work with high-stakes organizations before and after critical incidents to make sure close calls don't slowly erode how people think, take responsibility, and lead. Because when judgment deteriorates, performance automatically does too, even inside organizations that look fully compliant. So here's the core insight on this. When organizations only focus on preventing the exact failure that just occurred instead of extracting the right lessons from it, people don't return to high-stress environments operating with the best judgment. In fact, they actually miss an opportunity. Bad events don't just expose real risk, they reveal where their judgment, communication, and decision-making can actually get much better. That's actually the opportunity there. When the only goal becomes never let this happen again, the system just becomes more rigid and reactive to the same exact conditions that just took place. And as most of us know, those same exact conditions almost never happen in the exact same way ever again. So the organization stays protected from the last failure, but loses the chance to become more capable of handling the next challenge. So what the Challenger disaster really teaches us is that rules aren't dangerous per se, but it teaches us that when people and systems don't recover well from the previous failures, they start correcting in the wrong direction. And over time, unresolved fear changes how people actually relate to risk. Instead of rebuilding confidence in people's judgment, the system actually slowly shifts away from trusting people and hands it over to rules and policies and procedures, because the rules feel safer, they feel objective, they feel defensible, they feel like a protection from future failure. And over time, that overcorrection actually creates the very conditions that many failures are more likely to happen under. Why? Well, because high-risk environments never repeat themselves exactly the same. When people stop trusting their judgment, when they're trained to defer instead of interpret, when they rely on rules instead of thinking, they lose the ability to adapt when reality really doesn't match the procedure in front of them. The system becomes too rigid, and too rigid systems fail just like ones that are undefined. The real correction after failure is not clamping down and more rules and trying harder. It's actually threading the needle. It's finding that balance between rules that manage unknown risk and judgment that can respond to the unknown. But fearful systems don't do that very well. Fear pushes people to overreact, to control instead of calibrate, to eliminate discretion instead of define and refine it. The Challenger didn't fail because NASA trusted judgment too much. It actually failed because over time, fear trained the system to trust judgment less and less. And the belief that rules alone can keep failure from happening again, well, that's just silly. And that's actually catastrophically wrong. Rules are necessary. They help us manage known risk, but judgment is what allows people to adapt to the reality in front of them when it doesn't match what the rules say. Rules should support judgment, not replace it. And what organizations do after critical incidents determines whether they become safer and more capable, or only safe on paper and fragile in actual reality. So if this sounds familiar, this might be worth a conversation. Many organizations focus on getting back to operational readiness, and they do it well. We focus on the parts that most organizations miss, how critical incidents change how people think and lead afterwards.